The woman standing in my driveway that morning had not seen our son in 18 years, and the first thing she did was cry. I was watering the flowers outside our little house near Bozeman, Montana, when I heard tires crunch against the gravel. Ethan was sitting on the porch swing with his headphones on, watching the clouds the way he always did when he needed quiet. He was 21 now, tall, gentle, smarter than I would ever be, but still the same boy who smiled whenever he saw birds land in the backyard. I looked up and saw a black Mercedes slowly pulling into the driveway. We did not get many visitors. Susan Miller from next door drove an old pickup truck. The mailman came around noon, and Ethan rarely invited people over. The car stopped. The driver's door opened, and suddenly my hands froze. I dropped the watering can. Water spilled onto my boots, but I barely noticed. The woman stepping out of that car looked older. Her blonde hair was shorter. Her face carried lines I did not remember, but I knew her immediately. Rebecca, my wife, the mother of my son, the woman who disappeared 18 years ago. She stood there staring at the house. Then she looked at me. Tears filled her eyes instantly. I felt like the air had disappeared. I had imagined this moment hundreds of times over the years. Sometimes she came back angry. Sometimes she came back sick. Sometimes she came back because she regretted everything. But none of those dreams prepared me for reality. She whispered my name. Daniel. I could not answer. Not because I hated her. I stopped hating her years ago. Hate takes energy, and I needed all my energy to raise our son. Ethan looked up from the porch. He noticed the strange car. Then he noticed the woman. He slowly stood up and walked toward me. He always noticed details before emotions. That was just Ethan. He looked at Rebecca carefully. She began crying harder. Oh my God, she whispered. He looks just like you. Ethan tilted his head slightly. Dad, he asked softly. I swallowed hard. Yes, buddy. He pointed toward her. Why is that lady crying? Rebecca covered her mouth. Her entire body started shaking. I had not seen her cry since the day Ethan was diagnosed, and that memory alone made my chest hurt. She took one small step forward. Ethan stepped closer to me instead. Not afraid, just uncertain. Daniel, Rebecca whispered. Please. Her voice broke. Please let me talk to him. I looked at my son. He adjusted his glasses and studied her face. He had always done that. People fascinated him. Patterns fascinated him. Faces fascinated him. But strangers made him nervous. Rebecca slowly knelt down. Tears streamed down her cheeks. Ethan, she whispered. I am your mother. Ethan looked at her. Then he looked at me. Then back at her again. For nearly 30 seconds, nobody moved. The wind rustled the trees behind the house. Somewhere down the road, a dog barked. And then Ethan asked a question that made my heart stop. He looked directly at me and quietly said, Dad, why did she wait until now to miss me? For a moment, nobody answered Ethan's question. Rebecca covered her mouth and cried even harder. I stood beside my son and felt 18 years of memories pressing against my chest. Ethan looked confused. He always noticed things that other people missed. And sometimes, without meaning to, he asked questions nobody wanted to answer. Rebecca slowly stood up. Her hands trembled. Ethan, she whispered. I never stopped missing you. Ethan blinked. He looked at her carefully. Then he turned to me. Dad, she says she missed me. But if people miss something, they look for it. I closed my eyes. That was Ethan. He never understood why people said one thing and did another. He liked facts, patterns, logic. Emotions confused him sometimes. But honesty never did. Rebecca burst into tears. Oh God, she whispered. I deserve that. Ethan frowned slightly. Dad, why is she apologizing to God? I placed my hand gently on his shoulder. Because sometimes people feel sad about things they cannot change. Ethan nodded slowly. That answer seemed to make sense to him. Rebecca wiped her eyes. Daniel, please. Just let me explain. I looked at the mountains behind our house. 18 years ago, I dreamed about this moment. I dreamed about screaming. About asking why. About demanding answers. But life has a strange way of changing anger into exhaustion. I simply felt tired. Explain what? I asked softly. Her voice broke. Everything. Ethan sat back down on the porch swing. He put his headphones around his neck and quietly listened. He always listened. He remembered things most people forgot. Rebecca looked around the yard. She noticed the bird feeders Ethan built. The small vegetable garden. The wind chimes Susan gave us 10 years ago. She looked at the porch swing Richard, my father, built before he passed away. Everything around her represented years she had never seen. "He is so handsome," she whispered through tears. I smiled. "He knows." Ethan nodded. "Dad tells me every day." Rebecca cried harder. I wanted to come back so many times. I did not answer, because I remembered the first year after she left. Ethan was 3. He would sit by the front window every evening. He called every blonde woman mommy. Every single one. Grocery stores were the worst. Once, he hugged a stranger's leg and smiled because her hair looked like Rebecca's. The poor woman cried. I cried too, but Ethan never understood why. Rebecca wiped her face. "Daniel, I was scared. I know. I did not know how to handle his diagnosis. I know. I was selfish. I know. I hated myself. I know." She looked shocked. "You know?" I nodded. "Rebecca, I stopped trying to understand why you left years ago." Tears rolled down her face. "You hate me." I looked over at Ethan. He was watching birds. Completely calm. Completely safe. "No," I said quietly. "I do not hate you." That answer made her cry harder than anything else. Then Ethan suddenly stood up and walked toward her. Rebecca froze. She looked terrified, but Ethan simply looked at her face. He tilted his head slightly. Then he smiled softly. "You have my eyes," he said. Rebecca began shaking. "Yes." Ethan smiled again. "Dad says my eyes look like yours." Rebecca covered her mouth. She looked like she might collapse from emotion. Then Ethan asked another question. "If you are my mother, why do I not remember your voice?" Rebecca closed her eyes and cried. And before I could say anything, a pickup truck pulled into our driveway. Susan Miller stepped out carrying a pie. She looked at Rebecca, then at me. Then she whispered something that made my blood run cold. "Daniel, I think you better come inside. You need to see what they are saying about Ethan on television." Susan rarely looked worried. That was one thing I loved about her. The woman had survived breast cancer, 2 divorces, and 30 years teaching 3rd grade. Nothing rattled Susan Miller, but the look on her face made my stomach tighten. "Daniel," she said softly, "you really need to see this." Ethan followed us into the living room. Rebecca stayed near the front door, almost afraid to come inside. Susan placed the pie on the counter and picked up the remote. The local news channel filled the television screen. Ethan immediately covered one ear. He hated loud sounds. I lowered the volume, and then I saw my son's face. Ethan blinked. "Dad," he whispered. "That is me." The news anchor smiled. 21-year-old software developer Ethan Carter has become one of Montana's youngest self-made entrepreneurs after the acquisition of his accessibility platform by a major technology company. Rebecca stopped breathing. I could hear it. Susan looked down. She had known for weeks. But she promised Ethan she would keep it private until everything became official. I sat beside my son and smiled. "Congratulations, buddy." Ethan adjusted his glasses. "They used my school picture." Susan laughed softly. "They did." Ethan frowned. "That picture was terrible." I laughed for the first time all morning. Then the reporter continued. "Sources confirm the deal is valued at approximately $3.1 million after taxes and fees." Rebecca sat down slowly. She looked pale. Tears rolled down her face again. But this time something felt different. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe I did not. Ethan watched the television quietly. He never cared much about money. Numbers interested him, but money itself did not. "Dad." "Yes." "Can I still feed the birds after lunch?" I smiled. "Of course." "Good." He nodded. "Because the birds do not know I am on television." Susan burst out laughing. Even Rebecca smiled through tears. Then Ethan looked at her. "Do you like birds?" Rebecca wiped her face. "Yes. Dad likes robins." Ethan pointed toward the window. "And I like blue jays." Rebecca nodded slowly. "That is wonderful." Ethan smiled politely. "Thank you." Then he returned his attention to the birds outside. Susan touched my arm gently. "Daniel, can I talk to you?" We stepped into the kitchen. She lowered her voice. "Did she know?" I looked toward Rebecca. She sat quietly watching Ethan. "Know what?" Susan sighed. "About the money." I shook my head. "She showed up before you turned on the television." Susan looked relieved. "Good." Then she hesitated. "Because if she knew." I nodded. "I know." Susan squeezed my hand. "Just be careful." When I returned to the living room, Rebecca stood beside Ethan. He was showing her pictures of birds on his tablet. "This one is my favorite," he explained. "Dad and I rescued one last spring." Rebecca smiled through tears. "You save birds?" Ethan nodded proudly. "Dad says if something is small and scared, You help it. Rebecca closed her eyes. Those words hit her hard. Because once upon a time, Ethan was small and scared too. I sat beside them. For a few moments, everything felt peaceful, almost normal. Then Rebecca reached into her purse. Daniel, she said quietly, I need to tell you something. I looked at her face. She seemed nervous. Ashamed. What is it? She pulled out her phone. I found out about Ethan 2 weeks ago. The room became silent. Susan stopped moving. Ethan looked up from his tablet, and Rebecca whispered words that made my heart stop. I saw an article online, and I searched his name before I came here. The room became so quiet that I could hear the clock above the refrigerator ticking. Ethan looked up from his tablet. Susan stood near the counter holding her breath. Rebecca sat with her phone in her hand and tears in her eyes. But tears and truth are not always the same thing. You searched his name? I asked quietly. Rebecca nodded. Yes. Her voice trembled. I saw the article 2 weeks ago. Ethan blinked. People search me sometimes. He smiled proudly. Last month somebody in Ohio sent me a picture of a blue jay. Nobody laughed. Ethan noticed immediately. Did I say something wrong? I sat beside him. No, buddy. Rebecca looked at him with tears rolling down her cheeks. I searched your company. I searched your interviews. I searched your school pictures. She paused. I wanted to know the man you became. Susan crossed her arms. She had known me 30 years. She knew when I was angry. She also knew when I was disappointed. And disappointment always hurt more. Rebecca, Susan said softly, did you search him before or after you saw how much money he made? Rebecca froze. Ethan looked up again. Money. Susan immediately regretted saying it. But it was too late. Ethan frowned slightly. Dad. I smiled. It is okay, buddy. Rebecca lowered her head. After. Nobody spoke. Even the birds outside seemed quiet. Ethan adjusted his glasses. $3.1 million? Rebecca slowly nodded. Yes. Ethan looked confused. Dad, why are people surprised? I smiled. Because most people do not see what I see. Ethan smiled back. The birds. And everything else. He nodded happily and returned to his tablet. Susan shook her head. Lord help me, I love that boy. Rebecca began crying again. I know what you are thinking. I looked at her calmly. Do you? You think I came back because of the money? Susan muttered under her breath. Hard not to. Rebecca stood up. No. Her voice cracked. I came because I saw his face in that article. And I realized I wasted 18 years. I wanted to believe her. God knows I wanted to. But 18 years is a long time. Long enough to forget birthdays. Long enough to miss first words. Long enough to miss graduations. Long enough to miss tears. Rebecca, I said quietly. Did you ever search his name before 2 weeks ago? She closed her eyes. That silence answered everything. Ethan suddenly stood up. Dad, I am hungry. I smiled immediately. Turkey sandwiches? He nodded. And chips. Susan laughed. I brought pie too. Ethan smiled. You are the best neighbor. Susan hugged him. And you are my favorite genius. Ethan shook his head. I am not a genius. He looked at me and smiled. Dad says I am just Ethan. Rebecca watched everything with tears in her eyes. The way he hugged Susan. The way he trusted me. The way he smiled when somebody remembered the little things. She was seeing 18 years of love she had missed. Then Ethan stopped halfway to the kitchen. He turned around and looked directly at Rebecca. Can I ask you something? Rebecca nodded immediately. Anything. Ethan smiled politely. Did you know my favorite color when you search me? Rebecca froze. No. Did you know I hate loud noises? Tears filled her eyes. No. Did you know I sleep with the fan on because silence makes me nervous? Rebecca covered her mouth. No. Ethan nodded slowly. Then he asked one more question. So what exactly were you trying to find? And the answer Rebecca gave made Susan nearly drop the pie plate in her hands. For a moment, nobody moved. Susan held the pie plate with both hands and stared at Rebecca. I sat beside Ethan and waited. Rebecca looked like she wanted to disappear. Ethan simply waited for an answer. He always did. He believed questions deserved answers. That was one thing I admired about my son. He never played games. He never pretended. What exactly were you trying to find? He asked again. Rebecca looked down at her phone. Her voice shook. I was trying to find you. Ethan blinked. No. He smiled politely. I mean before today. She closed her eyes. I do not know. Susan muttered softly. At least she is honest. Tears rolled down Rebecca's face. I saw your picture in the article, and I realized I missed everything. Ethan sat quietly. Then he nodded. That is true. Rebecca looked up. What? You missed everything. Her lips trembled. But Ethan continued. You missed my dinosaur phase. Susan covered her mouth. You missed when I collected rocks. Rebecca cried harder. You missed when I learned multiplication tables. Tears streamed down her face. You missed when Dad cried because I had my first panic attack. I felt my chest tighten. Ethan rarely talked about those things. You missed when Susan taught me how to bake cookies. Susan started crying. And you missed my graduation. Rebecca sat down and covered her face. But Ethan was not angry. He was simply listing facts. The same way he talked about birds. Or weather. Or train schedules. Facts mattered to Ethan. I am sorry, Rebecca whispered. Ethan nodded. I know. Do you hate me? He frowned. No. She looked surprised. You do not. Ethan shook his head. Hating takes too much energy. Susan suddenly laughed through her tears. Lord, he gets that from his father. Ethan smiled. Dad says angry people get headaches. I laughed softly. That is true. Rebecca looked at me with tears in her eyes. You taught him that. I nodded. Among other things. Then Ethan looked at her again. Can I ask one more question? Rebecca nodded immediately. Anything. Why did you leave? The room became silent again. Even Susan stopped breathing. Rebecca looked toward the window. The mountains behind our house were turning gold in the afternoon sun. Because I was afraid, she whispered. Ethan tilted his head. Of me? She cried harder. No. Of autism? Yes. Ethan nodded slowly. But autism is just how my brain works. Rebecca covered her mouth. I know. Dad says everybody's brain is different. He is right. Ethan smiled softly. Susan says I notice beautiful things. Susan wiped her eyes. You sure do, sweetheart. Ethan looked back at Rebecca. Then why were you afraid? Rebecca broke completely. Because I was weak. Nobody spoke. Not me. Not Susan. Not even Ethan. Then my son walked over and handed her a tissue. Just like he did whenever Susan cried during sad movies. Dad says weak people can become stronger, Ethan said kindly. Rebecca took the tissue with trembling hands. Thank you. Ethan smiled. You are welcome. Then he looked at me. Dad. Yes, buddy. Can she stay for dinner? Susan almost dropped the pie again. I stared at my son. Rebecca stared at him too. And then Ethan said something that made every adult in that room cry. Birds come back when they know they are safe. Maybe people do too. Rebecca stayed for dinner. Even saying those words felt strange after 18 years. Susan insisted on helping in the kitchen. Ethan happily arranged bird-shaped napkins because he said special guests deserved special napkins. Rebecca sat quietly at the table watching him. Sometimes she smiled. Sometimes she cried. Mostly she just looked overwhelmed, as if she had stepped into a life that kept moving without her. During dinner, Ethan talked about blue jays. Susan talked about her tomato garden. I talked about the weather. Nobody mentioned money. Nobody mentioned the article. For 1 hour, we were simply people eating turkey sandwiches and pie. And strangely enough, that felt harder for Rebecca than any argument could have. After Susan left, Ethan brought out an old photo album. He loved looking at photographs. He always organized them by year. Patterns made him happy. Look, he said proudly. Dad labeled everything. Rebecca opened the first page and immediately covered her mouth. There was Ethan at age 4 holding a stuffed dinosaur. Age 5 feeding ducks. Age 6 wearing oversized glasses. Birthday cakes. School pictures. Halloween costumes. Christmas mornings. 18 years of memories. And she had missed every one. You kept all of these? She whispered. I smiled softly. Every single one. Ethan nodded. Dad says memories matter. Rebecca cried quietly. I do not deserve to see these. Ethan looked confused. Why? Because I was not there. Ethan thought about that. Then he shrugged. But you are here now. She started crying harder. I tucked the album away and suggested tea. Ethan disappeared upstairs to organize his bird books. Rebecca and I sat on the porch. The sun had already disappeared behind the mountains. The evening air was cool. Daniel, she whispered. Why are you being so kind? I smiled sadly. Because bitterness gets heavy after 18 years. Tears rolled down her face. I do not deserve your kindness. Maybe not. She nodded. Then why? I looked toward the stars beginning to appear. Because Ethan is watching us. She lowered her head. He is extraordinary. I laughed softly. No. He is just Ethan. Rebecca smiled through tears. You always say that. Because it is true. Silence settled between us. Then she reached into her purse again. Daniel, I need to show you something. She handed me her phone. I frowned. What is this? My search history. I stared at her. She nodded slowly. You deserve to see it. At first, I did not understand. Then I started reading. Ethan Carter Software Company. Ethan Carter Net Worth. Accessibility Startup Acquisition. Ethan Carter Interview. How to Reconnect with Adult Son. I closed my eyes. Rebecca began crying immediately. Please do not stop there. I continued reading. Autism Support Groups. Parenting Children with Autism. Books about autism. Signs your child remembers abandonment. I looked at her. She was shaking. I started with the money, she admitted. I know. But somewhere along the way, I started searching for him. Tears streamed down her face. And then I realized I did not even know what autism really was. I stayed quiet. Daniel, she whispered. I spent 18 years running from something I never tried to understand. We sat in silence. Then Ethan opened the front door. He smiled happily. Dad, Susan forgot her pie plate. I smiled. I will take it over tomorrow. Ethan nodded. Then he looked at Rebecca. Would you like to see my bird journals? Rebecca smiled through tears. Very much. Ethan grinned. Good. There are 43 notebooks. Rebecca laughed for the first time all day. 43. 44 if you count the hummingbird book. She followed him inside. I sat alone on the porch for a moment. Then my phone buzzed. It was William Harris, our attorney. He rarely called at night. I answered immediately. And after listening for only 10 seconds, I felt the blood drain from my face. Because somebody had already contacted his office asking about Ethan's assets. And William had just discovered exactly who that person was. My hands started shaking as I listened to William Harris on the phone. He had been our attorney for nearly 15 years. He handled everything after my father died. He helped Ethan establish the trust for his company. And he knew one thing better than anyone. I hated surprises. Daniel, William said quietly, I need you to stay calm. I looked through the kitchen window. Ethan sat beside Rebecca showing her bird journals. For the first time in 18 years, I saw them laughing together. Who contacted your office? I asked softly. William sighed. Not Rebecca. I froze. What? It was a man named Gregory Bennett. The name meant nothing to me. Who is Gregory Bennett? Another pause. Rebecca's husband. I felt my knees weaken. Husband. Of course. 18 years was a long time. I sat down on the porch swing. What did he want? William's voice turned cold. Information. About what? About Ethan's trust. His investments. His company. I closed my eyes. Did you tell him anything? Absolutely not. William sounded offended. I hung up immediately. Did Rebecca know? I do not know. We sat in silence for several seconds. Then William spoke softly. Daniel, the man called twice. My heart sank. Twice. And he introduced himself as Ethan's stepfather. I rubbed my forehead. Ethan does not have a stepfather. William sighed. I know. I thanked him and ended the call. For several minutes, I sat alone staring into the darkness. Inside the house, Ethan's laughter drifted through the screen door. Rebecca laughed too. And somehow, that made everything harder. Because I wanted to believe her. God help me, I wanted to believe her. But now another person existed. A man I had never met. A man asking questions about my son. I walked back inside. Ethan looked up immediately. Dad, did you know cardinals sometimes recognize faces? I smiled. Really? Yes. He pointed at Rebecca. Mom likes cardinals. Rebecca smiled. They were always my favorite. Ethan grinned. Mine too. Then he yawned. I am tired. Rebecca stood immediately. Can I say goodnight? Ethan nodded. Okay. He hugged her awkwardly. Not because he disliked hugs. Physical affection simply confused him sometimes. But Rebecca held him gently and whispered, Good night, sweetheart. Ethan smiled. Good night. Then he disappeared upstairs. Silence settled over the living room. Susan had gone home. The dishes were clean. Only Rebecca and I remained. I sat across from her. Rebecca. She smiled softly. Thank you for letting me stay. Are you married? Her smile disappeared instantly. Tears filled her eyes. Daniel. Are you? She nodded slowly. Yes. My chest tightened. How long? 11 years. I looked away. Not because I was angry. Because suddenly 18 years felt real again. Does he know about Ethan? Yes. Did he contact William Harris? Rebecca froze. Color disappeared from her face. What? His name is Gregory Bennett. She stood up so fast the chair nearly fell over. No. He called twice. Tears flooded her eyes. Daniel, I swear to you, I did not know. I looked into her face. And for the first time that day, I believed her. Not because she cried, but because she looked horrified. Truly horrified. Where is Gregory now? I asked quietly. Rebecca grabbed her purse with shaking hands. In Denver. She pulled out her phone. And if he called your attorney, then I need to know why. Her fingers trembled as she stared at the screen. Then suddenly she gasped. And when she looked up at me, I saw pure fear in her eyes. Because Gregory had sent her a text message only 5 minutes earlier. And it contained just 6 words. Did you get close enough yet? Rebecca stared at her phone as if she had seen a ghost. Her face turned pale. Tears filled her eyes again, but these tears were different. Fear. Real fear. She handed me the phone without saying a word. I read the message twice. Did you get close enough yet? My stomach tightened. Rebecca covered her face with both hands. Daniel, I swear to you, I did not know. I looked into her eyes. For the first time that day, I saw something stronger than guilt. I saw shame. Sit down, I said softly. She sat immediately. Tell me everything. Rebecca nodded. Gregory and I met 11 years ago. Tears rolled down her cheeks. He was kind. Or at least I thought he was. She paused. He knew I had a son. But I never talked much about Ethan. I was ashamed of myself. I stayed quiet. 2 weeks ago I saw Ethan's article. I cried all night. She looked toward the stairs where Ethan slept. I wanted to see him. I wanted one chance. She swallowed hard. I told Gregory. And at first he supported me. Her voice broke. Then he started asking questions. She opened her phone and showed me dozens of messages. How much is the company worth? Did he inherit anything? Can his mother claim anything? Rebecca cried harder. Daniel, I thought he was just curious. I closed my eyes. And this message. She shook her head. I never answered him. We sat in silence. Then I asked quietly, does he know where you are? Rebecca froze. No. Are you sure? She nodded. I drove here alone. Suddenly, footsteps came down the stairs. Ethan appeared wearing dinosaur pajamas. He looked confused. Why are you crying again? Rebecca wiped her face. I am sorry. Ethan yawned. People cry a lot around me today. I smiled. Bad dreams. He shook his head. No. I forgot my hummingbird notebook. He walked over and stopped beside Rebecca. Then he noticed her shaking. Mom. She looked up immediately. It was the first time he had called her that. Her eyes widened. Yes. Dad says people who are scared should not be alone. Rebecca burst into tears. Ethan hugged her awkwardly. You can borrow my weighted blanket. She laughed through her tears. Thank you. It helps me when I feel bad. Then he smiled. You can have the blue one. He went back upstairs. Rebecca covered her mouth and cried quietly. He called me Mom. I smiled softly. He did. The next morning, Susan arrived with coffee. One look at Rebecca, and she knew something was wrong. After hearing the whole story, Susan frowned. Honey, that man sounds like a snake. Rebecca nodded. I know. Susan squeezed her hand. Then stopped protecting him. Around noon, William Harris arrived. He sat in our kitchen with a folder. Rebecca, he said kindly, I believe you. She started crying again. Thank you. William smiled gently. But your husband concerns me. He opened the folder. He called my office twice. He also contacted the bank managing Ethan's trust. I stared at him. What? William nodded. He got nowhere. But he tried. Rebecca looked sick. Then William handed her a document. There is something else. She took it with trembling hands. Her eyes widened. Then she whispered something that made my blood run cold. No. I grabbed the paper. And suddenly I understood why she looked terrified. Because 3 months earlier, Gregory Bennett had secretly filed for divorce. And Rebecca had no idea. Rebecca sat at the kitchen table holding the divorce papers with both hands. She looked completely lost. William Harris adjusted his glasses and quietly explained everything. Gregory Bennett had filed 3 months earlier. He had listed irreconcilable differences. He had moved money into separate accounts. And according to the records, he had already been seeing someone else. Rebecca simply stared at the papers. He knew, she whispered. He knew before I did. Susan Miller wrapped her arms around her shoulders. Honey, some people do not leave because you failed. They leave because they already checked out. Tears rolled down Rebecca's face. I spent 18 years regretting abandoning my son. And I spent 11 years with a man who abandoned me before I even knew it. William gently closed the folder. You have difficult days ahead, Rebecca, but you are not alone. At that moment, Ethan came downstairs carrying his hummingbird notebook. He looked around the room and frowned. Everybody is sad again. Susan laughed softly through her tears. That is because life is complicated, sweetheart. Ethan nodded. Birds are easier. He sat beside Rebecca and placed the notebook in front of her. Would you like to see page 17? Rebecca wiped her eyes. Okay, that is my favorite hummingbird. He smiled proudly. Dad helped me draw it when I was 12. Rebecca looked at the picture and started crying again. It is beautiful. Ethan smiled. Dad says beautiful things are worth waiting for. Then he looked directly at her. Do you know what I think? Rebecca smiled through tears. What? I think you are sad because somebody hurt you. She nodded. Yes. That happened to Dad too. I froze. Ethan looked at me and smiled. But Dad says broken things can still work. Susan completely lost control and started crying again. William wiped his eyes. Rebecca hugged Ethan carefully. I do not deserve you. Ethan frowned. That is not how families work. He looked confused. People always say deserve. Then he smiled. Birds do not deserve trees. Trees, just let them stay. Nobody in that room could speak after that. Months passed. Rebecca rented a small apartment near town. She started attending autism support meetings. She volunteered at the local library. She never asked Ethan for money. Never asked about his trust. Never mentioned his company. Sometimes she simply came over for dinner. Sometimes she sat quietly while Ethan talked about birds for an hour. And little by little, something changed. Not overnight. Not magically. But slowly. The way healing usually happens. One evening during Thanksgiving, Susan burned the rolls again. William brought terrible cranberry sauce. Everybody laughed. And while I carved the turkey, I noticed Ethan watching us with a smile. Dad, he said. Yes, buddy. Mom is staying for pie, right? Rebecca smiled nervously. If that is okay. Ethan looked offended. You always stay for pie now. Everyone laughed. Later that night, after everybody left, I found Ethan sitting on the porch watching the stars. What are you thinking about? I asked. He smiled. Mom missed a lot. Yes. But she is trying. Yes. He nodded. Dad, what? $3.1 million is a lot of money. I laughed. It sure is. Ethan smiled and leaned his head against my shoulder. But I think I got something better. What is that? He looked toward the kitchen window where Rebecca was washing dishes, while Susan argued with William about cranberry sauce. Then he smiled. I got the people who stayed. And I got back the person who finally came home. I looked up at the stars and smiled. Because after 18 years of silence, I finally understood something. Money had never made my son rich. Loved it,